And now I want to look at the question of racism, empire and war, neoliberalism, and economic crisis. So the not Bush factor became, sort of a dominant factor in the immediate election. The reason why this is important as sort of a backgrounder is I want to indicate that even though Obama had a significant public electoral mandate, the mandate was also about moving away from what had been before, as opposed to necessarily endorsing something that was to come. And I think that problem is now imposed on Obama's presidency, that there isn't a clear sense of a mandate of what was the sense of hope, what was the sense of change. There was a very big sense of a need to get away from something else. Now, what was that something else? So let's just sit for a minute and look at the question of racism. First of all, I think it's important to recognize, and this is in terms of this issue of, what does it mean to have a hegemonic bloc? If a ruling elite needs to have some support of the population, it doesn't mean you have the support of everyone. And for a period of time, the United States elite was quite consciously organized and run on the basis of plantation slavery and then segregation. They were called Jim Crow laws, separate laws for whites and blacks. This is an example of it. And without a tremendous amount of social movement change, this wasn't change that came from above, it was change that came from below in the civil rights movement in the United States, I don't believe those situations would have changed. So, there was really something that was apartheid-like conditions in the south of the United States, a lot of complicity in the north, and that the phenomenon of sort of the changes in the civil rights movement are significant. Now, they've been challenged before. This is a picture of Jesse Jackson, who ran for president in 1984 and 1988, and at that point his presidency was withdrawn on the grounds that the Democratic Party would likely split if they put forward a black American candidate, that the party itself couldn't tolerate that type of just visible diversity. So racism interacts with capitalism in specific ways, and currently it seems to me that there is something shifting in the American imaginary, in the American public space, about how race is to be understood. And the question of the relationship of race to class and empire is a complicated one, but one of the complicated features is that race, the way we commonly think of it as skin color or some type of identification or of hair or dentifrice, some biological characteristics, it simply doesn't exist. It simply doesn't exist. There's no correlation between the biological characteristics that we associate with race and any other human characteristic, with intelligence, with emotion, with patterns of aptitude. There's absolutely no relationship. So race doesn't exist, except that racism is so entrenched in the hegemonic rule and in the ideology, racial stereotyping, profiling, replacing race with conceptions of religion or culture or accent, that it tends to become extremely real and take on a material form in ways that actually shape people's experience. So racism is a complicated factor. In the post-World War II period, by and large internationally, the labor market demands have compelled tremendous changes in the racial composition of public workforce and have compelled changes in the ideologies of racism. And in general, borders have become much more open. Immigration has become much more open. Canada used to have quotas in terms of its immigration. Now that's been moved away to a point system, which is considered to be much more based on labor market factors and so on. But this started to change after 9/11. This is a picture of Mahara Rar, who was racially profiled, deported to torture, has since been proven to be innocent, has received an apology from the government. So what's happened in 9/11? At 9/11, as opposed to the general change of, we're becoming more permeable, more open, less racist, 9/11 alerted us that, we have to tighten our borders. There was a new kind of racialism of the borders, of security, that is still with us. And the United States got caught in this quite profoundly. George Bush, the son of plantation America, the swaggering Texan, white American, became increasingly identified as also someone who was crafting a kind of racism that's come to be known as Islamophobia. You know, a sense that if you see someone who looks like a terrorist, they should be treated differently. And this is now widely documented. You know, any of us who travel in airports, many of us can probably you can just identify, you know, there's now a series of studies about what is called traveling while Arab. I mean, it's an absolutely well-known phenomenon that there's stereotyping of what looks like a terrorist. Now, obviously, there's no relationship between physical characteristics and a political ideology, but we've come to sort of re-establish that in terms of sort of the normal ways that borders open. So this has been identified as not a new phenomenon, it's a historic phenomenon. Edward Said is a theorist of what's referred to as Orientalism. It's very similar to what we call Islamophobia. But what happens with the phenomenon of Barack Obama is now we have the entry of an African-American president into the White House who's been identified by a section of the US elite as someone who indicates that the United States is very much not racist. So this is a quotation from two New York Times reporters who identified some of the significance that they saw of what the Obama phenomenon meant in terms of America's global positioning around racism and empire. For years, the terrorist network sought to fuel anti-Americanism with prolific audio and video recordings vilifying President Bush as the leading American crusader against Muslim nations. The election of Mr. Obama, a black man who has spent part of his childhood in Indonesia and whose father was from a Muslim family, has muddied al-Qaeda's message. So similarly, this is from The Economist. The Economist is a news weekly that's published out of Britain. It's a very far-sighted, consciously elite publication. So it gives you a sort of good insight into the discourse of how the most far-sighted intellectuals associated with maintaining and sustaining American and global imperialism is thinking. So, what did the economists say? First of all, they endorsed Obama in the last weeks of election. They were holding back for a while, and in the last weeks they came out. Is Mr. Obama any better? Most of the hoopla about him has been about what he is rather than what he would do. His identity is not as irrelevant as it sounds. Merely by becoming president, he would dispel many of the myths built up about America. It would be far harder for the spreaders of hate in the Islamic world to denounce the great Satan if it were led by a black man whose middle name is Hussein, and far harder for autocrats around the world to claim that American democracy is a sham. So that was before the election. Then, celebrating the outcome, again The Economist, no one should doubt the magnitude of what Barack Obama achieved this week. When the president-elect was born in 1961, many states, and not just the South, had laws on the books that enforced segregation, banned mixed-race unions like that of his parents, and restricted voting rights. This week, America can claim more credibly than any other Western country to have at last become politically colorblind. America will now have a president with half-brothers in Kenya, old schoolmates in Indonesia, and a view of the world that seems to be based on respect rather than confrontation. That matters. Under George Bush's America, international standing had sunk to awful lows. So gaining the consent of a section of the oppressed, a section of what Gramsci called the subaltern, is often the preferred rule of a capitalist elite. It's actually better to govern if you've got people agreeing with you about governance than if you have constant social movements, resistance, strike waves, threatened instability, and so on and so forth. So racism is often a refined weapon in the war of ideas. It's part of the age-old method of divide and conquer, and what we are watching seems to me to be a realignment of the hegemonic moment. It's not anti-racist, but it's trying to see that anti-black racism is a thing that America calls its past, and Islamophobia is something that maybe is a little bit not racist. It's a little bit different. It's anesthetizing it in a certain way.